By the end of the Third Age, Morgoth had been gone for thousands of years. His physical body had been killed, and his spirit had been banished into the void, where it could no longer have a direct impact on Arda. But even though Morgoth was gone, his legacy remained, tormenting Middle-earth for ages to come. So in this video, we look at the legacy of Morgoth, and how his actions in the First Age and earlier were still affecting Middle-earth in the Third Age. Before you've even clicked on this video, you've probably immediately thought of one of the ways Morgoth was still affecting Middle-earth: his creations and his servants, many of whom survived him. This one is fairly obvious, so I'm not going to spend long talking about it, but I can't not talk about it. Morgoth was directly responsible for the creation of creatures such as orcs, trolls, dragons, probably wargs, and who knows what else. These servants would continue to terrorize Middle-earth for thousands of years, and many of them would form a significant part of the armies that were later deployed by Sauron and his servants during the Third Age. While Morgoth was far removed from these servants, he still bears a huge amount of responsibility for them. They would absolutely not exist if not for his twisted experiments, and while these creatures did still have free will, and some were more willing to exercise it than others after Morgoth's fall, it's hard to absolve Morgoth of responsibility. After all, in most circumstances, a parent can't be blamed if they have a child who grows up to be a serial killer, but they can be blamed if they raised their child specifically to become a serial killer, and I think that kind of describes Morgoth. And then there's the beings that Morgoth did not create but did corrupt: Sauron, the Balrogs, and all the other Maya and spirits who entered his service. Some of these beings were inclined towards evil, and some could be evil independently of Morgoth, such as Ungoliant, but it's hard to determine whether these beings would truly fall without Morgoth's meddling in the music of the Ainur, and later his rebellion against Eru and the Valar. At the very least, Morgoth offered them a feasible alternative, giving them the ability to act on their dark impulses. But once again, these beings all had free will, and in the case of Sauron, he was offered an opportunity to repent, but declined it and doubled down on evil. While he wouldn't be entirely absolved, you can't lay the blame at Morgoth's feet for Sauron's actions in the Third Age. Morgoth didn't just corrupt the powerful, he was also responsible for the original corruption of men, and during the First Age and even into the Second Age, many men willingly served him or even worshipped him as a god. While Morgoth's corruption over men did recede during the Second Age, his original teachings did make many men in Middle-earth more susceptible to Sauron's own corruption later on, because these men were already inclined to serve the Dark, were averse to the West and whatever was associated with it, and their societies had often already normalized values such as greed, cruelty, and unchecked ambition. If not for Morgoth's original corruption, there's an argument to be made that less men would have ended up serving Sauron in the Third Age. It wasn't just men who were corrupted though. While no elves willingly served Morgoth, he did still leave his dark mark upon them, and on some more than others. For example, we're told that some fallen elves, usually belonging to the Avari, who were always hesitant when it came to the West, would resist the call to the halls of Mandos upon dying, because they had been corrupted, even just a little, by Ardamard, which I'll talk about in a second. Instead, these elves would linger as houseless spirits, and sometimes they could be enslaved by Morgoth, and even during the Third Age, some would be enslaved by Sauron or even the Witch King. It's often theorized that the Barrow-wights are actually corrupted and enslaved elven spirits. Despite being created by the Witch King, catching them at all was only possible due to Morgoth's influence. But Morgoth left behind another legacy that was perhaps just as damaging as his old servants: the Taint. You may have heard of the term Morgoth's Ring. Well, just as Sauron poured his power into the One Ring, Morgoth poured his power into Arda itself, significantly weakening himself but creating Ardamard. To put it simply, this resulted in the gradual, irreversible fading of magic in Middle-earth, which is actually a lot worse sounding than what it is, because it affected everything: elves, dwarves, men, and all of their works. This is partially why the Third Age is something of a dark age compared to the earlier ages, because everything is sliding towards the mundane as magic fades from the world. This is nowhere better demonstrated than with the Númenóreans. They were blessed by Eonwe, and like Valinor, Númenor was a blessed island that was immune to Ardamard. The Númenóreans were capable of great works that could not be matched by the men of Middle-earth. They had incredible healing skills, they could build walls and towers of unbreakable black stone, and they could craft and wield powerful bows made of steel, amongst many other things. But in Middle-earth, over time, they gradually lost this knowledge and were unable to replicate their old glories. And by the end of the Third Age, Gondor is merely an echo of old Numenor. Their skills of healing had declined substantially, they could no longer replicate old technology and craftsmanship, and much of the old wisdom and knowledge had been lost. And even worse, it doesn't just affect craft, it also affects people biologically, sort of. The Númenóreans who dwelt in Middle-earth gradually had their blessings stripped away by Arda-Mard, whether they opposed evil or embraced it. This is why their lifespan shortened, from living centuries to living only slightly longer than regular men. This is why their statures shortened. Aragorn, a tall man for his time, was still far shorter than many of his distant ancestors, and this is why their knowledge and wisdom gradually faded away, only occasionally manifesting in exceptional individuals like Denethor and Faramir. As for the elves, Arda-Mard weakened their bodies, eventually resulting in them being overpowered by their own spirits. This was the process of fading away. Eventually an elf would simply lose their body, which in reality isn't really different to dying. This is why the elves had to leave Middle-earth for Valinor, where this effect doesn't exist, because this is the inevitable fate of any elf that stays in Middle-earth forever. This is why Celebrimbor crafted the 3 elven rings, to halt this ancient decay created by Morgoth's malice, and this is why Rivendell and Lothlorien were such magical places even at the end of the Third Age. After the 3 lost their power, the magic of Rivendell and Lothlorien started rapidly fading, and both places were abandoned fairly early in the Fourth Age. While this was perhaps Morgoth's most ever-present legacy, he did leave behind others that played an important role in shaping Middle-earth. One example is climate. We're told that Morgoth's presence in the north left many lands unnaturally cold, even thousands of years after his fall. The best example of this is Forodwaith, the northern land beyond the Grey Mountains, which is described as bitterly cold and is used interchangeably with the name Northern Wastes, so not much there. But this cold didn't just stay in Forodwaith, it would drift into other lands. One such example is Forakel, the bay north of Eriador that was often icebound. And to the south of Forakel, the large region of Eriador was also often affected. Great storms and blizzards could come surging down from the north, and even worse than that, some winters could be insanely harsh. 2 examples are the Long Winter and the Fell Winter in the late Third Age, where much of Eriador became covered in snow for as many as 5 months of the year, resulting in famine and later floods when the snow melted. When the Witch King founded Angmar, he actually made use of the unnatural cold of the north, combining it with his sorcery to make eastern Eriador even colder than normal, causing the hobbits to migrate, and according to the Lossoth, he was able to summon powerful storms himself. Morgoth was also responsible for some of the geography that played an incredibly important role in Middle-earth. The best example are the Misty Mountains. They were raised by Morgoth as a hindrance to the Valar, which is why they run for over 1,000 miles in an almost unbroken line. Throughout the Second and Third Age, the Misty Mountains would act as a great divider in the Westlands, a hard separation between the lands of Eriador and Rhovanion. And because the mountains were often inhabited by orcs who would close the passes, travel from east to west or west to east could often be quite difficult. To make matters worse, storms and blizzards would often form in the mountains, bringing down rain and snow on either side of them that would often result in more flooding. Interestingly enough, the Fellowship may have run into a remnant of Morgoth's malice during their journey. While attempting the Redhorn Pass, they are assailed by a blizzard that forces them to turn back. While the films show this as being the creation of Saruman, the books suggest that it was the malice of Carathras itself that was causing it, and as we learn, the mountain had been called the Cruel by the dwarves for many years. Considering Carathras was created by Morgoth, it's very much possible that a splinter of his dark power remained in the mountain, rising up to assail people who sought to pass. Morgoth was also responsible for another of Middle-earth's most iconic locations, or perhaps infamous locations, Mount Doom. Morgoth raised Mount Doom in the First Age, and personally I wouldn't be surprised if he also raised the mountains around Mordor, which might explain their interesting shape. We're not sure whether Mordor was always a barren wasteland on account of the volcano, or whether it resembled the fertile paradise that appears in the Rings of Power show, but either way, Mount Doom is unique in the sense that it was the only known volcano in the Westlands at the end of the Third Age. Whether Mount Doom was always active, or whether Sauron somehow played a role there, we do know that the second Dark Lord cashed in on the creation of the volcano by the first Dark Lord by using it to his advantage. Mordor's barren landscape made it uninhabitable to Sauron's enemies, and the smoke and fumes that the mountain spewed forth obscured the sun, preventing it from weakening his servants. Ironically, Morgoth's creation would aid in his servants' destruction. Sauron forged the One Ring in Mount Doom, and thus, in the same place, it was destroyed. So by the time of the Third Age, even though Morgoth was ancient history, his legacy could be found everywhere. It could be found in his former creatures and his former servants. It could be found in the ideas and attitudes of many of the men across Middle-earth. It could be found in the inescapable entropic forces that gradually decayed Middle-earth and everyone in it. It could be found in the frozen landscape of Forgewaif and the harsh, deadly winters that assailed the northern lands. It could be found in the Misty Mountains. And it could be found at Mount Doom, where the fate of Middle-earth was ultimately decided in the Third Age. Perhaps, after Sauron suffered his final defeat, evil would dwindle and some of Morgoth's old malice would sleep, but there are some things, such as Arda Mard, that would not be resolved until the world was broken and remade. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. If you want more information about Arda Mard, you can check out my video on how Morgoth became so weak. It discusses how he sacrificed, perhaps unknowingly or unintentionally, his personal power in permanently damaging Arda. If you want more information about how Arda Mard affected Númenóreans, I also did a video about how the lifespans of the Dunedain declined. Anyways, cheers, farewell, and remember, I did my utmost best to avoid saying Morgoth's taint, which is how Tolkien often described it, because those two words together have been utterly ruined.